Good evening and welcome back to Poe Discussions with myself, Carmen Bolden, and
Jeannie Smith, that's me.
yes, and we have a very special guest tonight, and his name is Jackson Kuhl. And Jackson, if you would just kind of go ahead and start right into it and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm an author and a writer. I specialize in biography and historical fiction. I have three books. One is a nonfiction. It's a biography of an American Revolutionary War hero named Samuel Smedley. I'm in Connecticut, so he was during the American Revolution. Connecticut had its own navy, and he was the captain of the flagship of the Connecticut Navy. And
Nice.
then I have two Gothic novellas. One is Season of Whispers,
Okay.
which is my first one. And then I have another one coming out in 2025 called The Island of Small Misfortunes.
Oh, nice.
And I have written freelance for years. I used to work in journalism. I've been in a number of anthologies, including all three volumes of Love Letters to Poe. So,
Okay.
and that's how I found your wonderful podcast.
Yes, and through Sarah Crokel Smith, which we love, so or who we
Yes,
love, I should
Sarah's
say.
awesome.
Who do you love? Yeah, okay.
Yes, and love letters to Poe. So, well, Jackson, what are your stories that you have in Love Letters to Poe? If you want to talk a little bit about those.
The first one was it's called An Incident on Mulberry Street, and it's when she was putting together the first volume, the stories I think were very short. They were mostly flash fiction, so I think it's only about 1,000 words long or 1,500 words long. And that one was a story I had become interested in the idea of the phenomenon of phantom limbs, which is when people have amputations. Apparently, they can still feel the sensation of the limbs.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a story set in the post-Civil War era about that phenomenon. For the second volume, I sort of took the theme broadly about it was the Houses of Usher. So I took a broad look at the theme, and it's about I guess a con man trying to con his way into some real estate, and he gets conned.
Yeah.
He gets got. And then for the third volume, we have that's coming out this October
Mm-hmm.
on the theme of the Telltale Heart. Again, I took the theme of regret and took that broadly. So it's
Oh,
a story of
nice.
regret.
Okay. Oh, that'll we cannot wait for the third volume to come out. And so we've read both the first volume and second volume and cannot wait for the third. So and I think I do remember your stories. It's been a while since I've read them, but the I think it's The Last Stand of is it Sassacus
Jessica's
House?
House, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And I wrote it down and I do remember that. Yeah, that was a great short story.
Thank you, thank you.
I
Jeannie?
really like
Yeah.
that you fit with the historical fiction because I am a retired teacher, much like Carmen still is teaching now, but I retired teaching both history, science, well, all four subjects basically, but history and language arts was my main two. So, and I loved because in what I had to teach was Civil War and even American Revolution, all that kind of thing. So when I saw your story, talking about the privateer, um, and everything, I was very excited about that because most people don't realize that we did not have a standing navy during the American Revolution because we were not technically a country. So it was the private sector that was doing the battles and being captains of this. So that was kind of interesting to me. So, and plus it's around the same early times, right around, 20 years or 30 that Poe came about.
Mhm.
Sure,
What we
yeah.
were still everything. So would you tell us something about why I know because of where you live, Connecticut, that might be why you chose to talk particularly about that one particular privateer. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about why you centered around that time period, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, so it's funny you say that because in Season of Whispers, which is the first novella that I wrote, it's set in 1844 in
Mhm.
Eastern Connecticut, and that was just about when Poe was starting to get some notice. I'm not a Poe scholar, but I believe that's when he was just starting to get some things published and was starting to get some attention. And there's actually a scene in there. So just to backtrack. So the story is about I became fascinated with the transcendentalists, and in Massachusetts there had been a couple of transcendentalist utopian communities. One was called Brook Farm, just outside of Boston, and the other one was called
Mhm.
Fruitlands.
Mhm.
And so I kind of made this. I sort of combined and made a sort of fictional transcendentalist utopia commune in Eastern Connecticut. And of course, Louisa May Alcott was the daughter of Bronson Alcott, who was one of the co-founders of Fruitlands. And she actually wrote, just as a tangent, I highly recommend if you ever read her story. It's a barely fictionalized account of her childhood growing up briefly on this, because it only lasted, I think, about 8 months, 7, 8 months,
Yeah.
growing up on this utopian commune they were hard vegans. So
No.
no animals at all. In fact, to the point where they wouldn't even use candles because candles was using the labor of bees. So they were like
Oh,
hardcore
wow.
vegans.
Okay.
And this was somewhat difficult to do in a New England winter. So she wrote a story called Transcendental Wild Oats. I highly recommend it. It's hilarious about her time. And what's interesting to me was reading about her was that, later she's known for Little Women, but she actually wrote a lot of gothic short fiction that a lot of people don't know about. And stories about mummies, and so I sort of incorporated that because I was kind of taking things from all the transcendentalists. I kind of incorporated that into my book. And there's a point where the female lead actually becomes, she has this secret vice, in which is that she gets Poe stories through the mail order, through the mail, and then she sort of goes and hides herself and reads these stories because they're gothic tales, and she doesn't want anybody to know because she's embarrassed about it. So
Oh, that's
uh,
awesome.
I think to your point, Jeannie, when you choose a point in history to write about, what I like to do is I like to sort of see what all was going on at that time, like what was going
Right.
on contemporary. And it's like, oh wow, I didn't realize, like, because we sort of, when we study history, we sort of see them in, they're sort of compartmentalized or siloed, these different things. And you realize that actually a lot of these things were happening often at the same time.
Mhm.
And
Hmm.
it's a lot of fun to sort of bring them all together, that and make note that that one thing was happening, but also another thing was happening, and kind of bring it together to get. And I think it gives a more sort of sense of verisimilitude for the reader, that they're,
Yeah.
you know this is what that time was like.
Yeah, that's the thing
Yeah.
about when, especially when I was teaching and teaching history, especially because, like you said, there was so much stuff going on around the same times, but in different locales,
Mhm.
that you didn't really get a whole picture unless you touched each area,
Yeah.
especially because you're talking about transcendentalists. And the one thing about Poe is he was not a fan of transcendentalists.
No.
he, it
Right.
was like, yeah, yeah. I think if we could have pinpointed one thing that, when you think of a critic, when they snarl their nose or give a thumbs down or just like want to rag somebody, he would definitely be all over those transcendentalists and just
Yeah.
rip them to pieces.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting about the Louisa May Alcott thing about being in a
Mhm.
utopian society, but her having that gothic, uh, touch going on.
Hmm.
But yeah, that I just love that people connect history to things, and it's not just one, like you're saying, it's not one thing separated from everything. It's a whole, and you got to hit upon it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that leads me into the question: is how did you hit upon love letters to Poe? You said that you're being published in all three books, and Sarah. So what brought you? Because you said you weren't a scholar of Poe, but that doesn't mean anything. You had to have liked Poe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was a fan. I'm not sure how. I guess I may have just seen a submissions call for when she was because originally she was doing it as an online magazine, and then she decided to compile them together into a print volume. So I may have
Hmm.
just seen a submissions call. But my first introduction to Poe, I think, was probably seventh or eighth grade.
Hmm.
Okay.
We had sort of one of these things where you had to memorize, you had to pick a poem and you had to memorize it and recite it in front of the class.
Hmm.
Yep.
And it's one of those things I think that like it probably has zero effect on the students at the time, but years later, so I chose Annabelle Lee. Years later, I can still, it was many and many a year ago. I
There
can
you
go back
go
and
and
see
think
it.
about it.
It's just
Yes.
it is burned into my brain, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
so that was probably my first introduction, but I was uh, Carmen will like this. She's a high school English teacher. Was that I think I want to say 10th grade, maybe 11th. I had a great English teacher, and one of the assignments was the Cask of Amontillado, which is to
Ooh.
this day, I mean, what a banger, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
It's one
story.
of my favorites. Yeah.
It is my absolute favorite. I mean, I was just getting ready for this podcast. I was kind of flipping through. I got my Poe book that I think, one of these
Yeah. I saw
omnibuses
it back there.
that my
Yes.
mom bought me. I think my mom bought me sometime in like circa 1988. Uh,
Yeah.
Cool.
and I was just rereading that story, and it's just like it is just so just right out of the gate, just like he's like, Fortunato, man, don't
Yep.
like him. It's just right.
Yep.
That story is perfect from beginning to end, and
It
to
is.
today still my favorite Poe story.
Hmm.
But
Well,
that
what's so?
was
Oh,
uh,
sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, yeah, that was my introduction, and maybe that theme of vengeance of maybe Gothicism without the supernatural, maybe
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
what stuck. But yeah, just I felt that I think the emotion of revenge, even if we don't take it to that level, I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
something that everybody can, everybody, at least if they don't do it, everybody thinks about bricking somebody up in a wall, right?
Right.
Yeah. In our minds, we are putting them behind that wall right there. But
Yes.
what I think is also interesting about you bring up the Cask of Amontillado is because Poe's stories are not that long.
No.
And most
No.
people don't realize that these are short stories, but he compacts so much and you're
Hmm.
right in it from the very first to the very last. And so that's one of the things that I love about Poe. And I'm like you, yeah, we were having to memorize a Poe poetry when we were in grade school, and Annabelle Lee was one. So,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
Carmen, did you have a question?
Well, no, and I was going to say, I do not make students memorize those things anymore. Our curriculum really doesn't allow us the time to do that. But I totally agree with you, Jackson. I had to memorize a lot of different things when I was in school, and they stuck with me. Now it means more than it did then, and I kind of, in some
Yeah.
ways, I kind of wish we still had time to do that. But if I would pick something Poe and have them memorize it.
Because the students will
Well,
hate it at the time, but then like
Yes.
20 years they'll be like, ah.
yeah,
Oh, she
they'll
did
still
that.
have it in the back of their head, going, "Oh yeah."
Yeah.
So Jackson, tell us a little bit about how do you got into writing? I know you said you did a little freelancing and stuff like that. So have you always, from the time you got out of high school, is this been your career? Is what I'm asking. Is this where
Yeah,
you
it
started?
it has been, yes. So
Mhm.
yeah, when I graduated college, I wanted to get into the publishing industry, and I
Hmm.
moved to the New York area. That quickly segued into the dot-com boom,
Hmm.
and so I did a lot of work in the internet, web stuff. Did some coding, but did a lot of stuff in like education, building intranets, and a lot of
Okay.
but also did a lot of I fell into journalism and did a lot of web journalism, and then later became a freelance writer. I wrote for some children's magazines about history and archaeology. I did some grad work in archaeology. I did work
Cool.
for like over 10 years for these children's magazines, and did so everything I wrote had some kind of historical connection or um, more recently, and then I got into biography, and more recently, I ghostwrite memoirs for people.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
but then, like I said, I write books, and I mainly sort of now focus mainly on the books.
Okay.
So yeah, so to answer your question, yes, this has just been a sort of a lifelong career in sort of surfing the various waves of change,
Change.
ebb
Yeah.
and flow. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I noticed that you wrote for Atlas Obscura, and
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting. And so, like, what is it about some of the things that they have, like on, like their collection of? Because I know you can do book or you can do internet.
Yeah, so I wrote a couple of pieces for them. One was actually about my hometown in southern New Jersey, which many of the
Mhm.
towns down there were dry towns. So there was
Okay.
no alcohol, and there was this they were skirting they were able to the state had passed a law where you could have microbreweries.
Okay.
So, and that kind of overrode the local blue laws. And
Hmm.
so at the time, even though you couldn't open a bar, say, or sell in a grocery store, you could have a microbrewery. So that was, and it was, the town had originally been a Methodist camp. It had started as a Methodist summer camp and then grew into a year round. So it was an interesting piece going back to my hometown after so many decades,
Yeah.
and sort of mapping this change in attitudes. And actually, since then, they've gotten rid of the blue laws, and you can just go and buy a drink now, which I think is not as much fun as going to a microbrewery, which I
No.
think is a little bit more of a unique experience. But so that was,
Yeah.
and then I wrote, I did another piece for them about John O'Brien. I don't know if you can see, there's a drawing of his behind me,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
he did some very famous children's books in like the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
One was called Monsters and Trolls, and I think, and it stuck with a lot of people. A lot of people have from that time period a lot of nostalgic feeling for it. And he has this very intricate style of drawing in which there's a lot going on the page.
Hmm.
And so there would be, like you say, a picture of these trolls, but there'd be like countless little trolls doing all kinds of different things.
Hmm.
And there's been some research shown that that the more sort of visually engaging an illustration is, the more time you spend in this sort of, this is logical, right? That the more time you spend looking at something, the more it's ingrained in your memory. And there's
Okay.
actually been research that the more your eyes move on a picture, the more memories it's making in your brain. And so
Okay.
that was kind of fascinating, was that this and I think he'd done this unintentionally, but through just basically this was his drawing style, that drawing these very intricate drawings with all these little trolls, that it had the effect of people seeing it and remembering it decades later. Uh,
Hmm.
so yeah, so Atlas Obscura has been great. I love the stuff they do.
Yeah, they are awesome. I actually took a class on reading gravestones
Okay.
through there, and it was an online class. And we met, I think, like 4 different times. It was I learned a lot. It was amazing.
Yeah,
They
they're
they
great.
have yeah they have lots of different offerings to not just read and learn, but engage. So,
Now, you
Jeannie
said you like to do biographies. Do you choose the biographies yourself, or are they
or
just
memoirs.
something, yeah, or memoirs, or do they seek you out, or kind of both?
So right. So I was working for the company I was working for was they would say, hey, they would come to me and be like, hey, we got somebody in your area, and
Hmm.
and you would pitch for it. But what I loved was that just being in this area was I found myself doing a lot of immigrant stories.
Oh.
So
Okay.
I did, there was a couple had come over from Italy in the 1960s, and they had worked in the factories in Torrington, Connecticut, which is up in the northwest corner. It was a
Hmm.
very industrial area. Um, there was a woman in Stanford who had come over, again, come over in the 60s. She was from Ireland, and was basically a maid and domestic servant, and then had built a catering business out of that. And then I did the most recent story I did for them was again, he was in his 80s. He was from Puerto Rico, and he had come to the States in the 70s and in Stamford, Connecticut, and had basically found that there was an underserved Spanish-speaking market in Stamford, and had built basically this real estate empire
Mm-hmm.
simply because he was bilingual and he spoke Spanish. So it's been fascinating. These were probably it's not something that I'm not an immigrant. I was born here, but it's something that I probably wouldn't have chosen. But like I kind of found my carving myself out a niche in this sort of subgenre of immigrant stories, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I love doing it. So yeah.
That sounds exciting
It
because
does.
I actually, speaking of the Italians, I actually have a very good friend who lives in Boston, and her parents came over from Italy in the 60s also,
Hmm.
and they went into service, and now that they built up their own kind of service area, so they have an American story, I guess is what I'm getting to.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of cool that you were able to, sorry. Mm. You're able to write and acknowledge that those types are getting the American dream, I guess, so
Hmm.
to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting to me, and sounds like a great opportunity to make meet new people and make further connections
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and
Right.
find out more about history, because
Yeah. And
people coming from
culture.
other
And
countries.
culture
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, no. When I was doing the story of the Irish woman, she was talking about at one point she was talking about her childhood in Ireland, and she was talking about these agricultural laws that had been passed, and she was a child, she didn't really understand them, and but so I went and fortunately there's an Irish American club here in town, and I went and they actually have a library. It's mostly a bar, but you go upstairs and there's a library. And
That's cool.
I was able to go in there and do some research because I was like, I don't know what she's talking about. And it turned out that at one point what had happened was when England left, the UK left Ireland,
Yeah.
they were
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, you gotta pay us for because you've nationalized these castles that we built, and you gotta pay us for it. In Ireland, Eamon
Hmm.
de Valera, who was the prime minister, was like, we're not gonna pay you for land you took. And so what had happened was they had gotten into a sort of an economic war where they were embargoing, they weren't selling Irish goods to the UK, sort of, and they tit for tat, but
Hmm.
it was devastating for the Irish farmers. And this woman had grown up on a traditional Irish farm, and they had cattle, and so it was kind of devastating. So this moment for a couple of years was loomed very large in her mind of of them being sort of impoverished by these laws.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of cool, like going and being able to find out, and like and here was like tangible again, tangible history. Here was somebody who had, um, had experienced this.
Yeah.
Another thing was, I said this when I was the Italian couple, they were elderly, and we're doing the interview at their house, doing the interview, and the woman who she was in like she's in her 70s. She's like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
you want to meet my father?" I'm like,
Oh
"What?"
wow.
And
Oh
like
wow.
there's this little old man sort of tottering around in the background, and he comes out, and he must have been in his 90s, this little old man.
Uh-huh.
And I shake his hand, and they're telling me about him, and like and he was a child, he was drafted, and he fought. He was got because they were at the end of World War II, they were drafting kids, and he was like, yeah, so he was a kid in Mussolini's army, and I'm like, what?
Wow.
Whoa.
Wow.
Like, wow. So I just shook the hand of a guy who was in Mussolini's army, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
that did not happen that long ago, man. That was like, I was just,
That's
again,
surreal. That is
tangible
so
history. Like,
surreal. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
So,
Ooh.
I mean, that would definitely make me excited
Yeah.
because not only are you learning about history, all of a sudden you're getting it firsthand from someone who experienced it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in
Oh,
his defense, I don't think he joined voluntarily. He was drafted. So
oh no,
Right.
no,
just to be
no, yeah.
clear.
Most of them did not join,
Oh.
voluntarily back in
Yeah.
those days.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, I think he was like a young teenager and they just were grabbing everybody. But yeah, it was
Oh,
just,
yeah.
I was just, my chin was on the floor. Like, what?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's unreal. Oh my gosh. Well,
exciting.
what what author are there any authors that like you gain your inspiration from? Like who are your favorites?
I'm a big fan of Robert Aikman, who was a British weird fiction writer. So I love his stuff.
Mhm.
I'm very much into Herman Melville these days. I've been going through all
Okay.
his stuff, and of course Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a contemporary of his.
Hmm.
Um, he wrote a book called The Blithedale Romance, which again was about it was a fictionalized version of his time at Brook Farm, which was one of those transcendentalist utopias.
Hmm.
He had been there for, I think, just about a year, and then
Hmm.
he left because he became disillusioned. So he wrote a sort of a. Also, I highly recommend that novel. It's still funny today. It's called The Blithedale Romance.
Okay.
So those are probably the authors that are most had probably had most of an effect on my writing and what I do.
Okay. Yeah, one of my books on my, I guess, bucket list is Moby Dick, and I have not tackled it yet, but I want to really give it time
Yeah.
because I've heard it's a deep read, a lot going on, and it's one of those that again I've just got to make time for it. That may be a summer project.
Summer's a good
Yep.
time for that book. I think it's
Yeah,
very much a summertime book, you know. You
yeah,
can imagine
It's going to
yourself in
sound
the
weird, but it is kind of like one of those you want to take to the beach with you on vacation. Most people wouldn't
yeah.
think Moby Dick would be a would be, the type of book, because most people are like, oh, let's bring the romance novels or the magazines or things like that. But it's kind of interesting if you think about it, because Moby Dick takes place near the water. So why not take
Mhm.
it as a beach?
True,
Right,
very
You know,
true.
right.
it works for me.
Absolutely. I know, and I have I like the House of the Seven Gables, but
Oh yeah.
Jeannie is not a
Yeah.
fan. She and I have had our own discussions about that book, and I reread it, and when my husband and I were going to up to Boston, we were going to Salem because we actually went in and did the tour and everything. I'm like, I want to reread this and really just like, feel it when I go in there. And it was amazing. And
Yeah.
Jeannie's like,
Mm,
ah.
That's a
no.
separate podcast. I would love to to get into that discussion.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
But
well, I'm not gonna tell. That was something I was made to read in freshman high school. Because our teacher, we had to read a book once a week and do an essay and have it turned in on Monday.
mhm.
So we were assigned like every Monday a new book to read. And when he assigned me that book, I got 3 pages in, and I don't know, I just got such a violent reaction because I just couldn't take it. I just like I can't make myself read this book. And it's kind of like the same reaction I had to Some Words with a Mummy
Mm,
from Edgar
Oh,
Allan Poe. I am
yes.
a Poe fan, diehard Poe fan, and everything, but that doesn't mean that I am in love with every single thing that he did.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
because you might love somebody at what they write, sing, on TV, whatever, the characters, actors, writers, whatever, doesn't mean you're going to love every single thing that they do.
Oh, true. I totally agree with that. I do,
And
and we do a monthly. We call it our Poe Unplugged. It's our unbook club where we Zoom with several people, and at the beginning of the month, they know what we're going to read. It could be one of Poe's poems. It could be one of his short stories, and
mhm,
occasionally we'll throw in a discussion on like the TV show, The Fall of the House of Usher, things like
okay.
that. And so Jeannie is referring to when we read Some Words with a Mummy. And I think you might have been the only person who loathed that story. There were a few people that weren't like as fascinated with it. I
Yeah, there
liked
was
it.
some that didn't hate it, but they weren't very, it wasn't one of the top picks of his. Yes,
Yeah.
I was actually the only one that really loathed it, and I still do. Sorry, I just do.
It's okay.
I'll
It's
just say,
okay.
yeah, it's one of those stories that like the premise, like I'm on board with the premise, and
Yeah.
then it's just
Mhm.
like nothing really happens, and you feel like it's a spoiled premise. Yeah, I hear you on
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, you like you said, you get caught up in like, oh, this is going to be really good, and then all of a
Yeah,
sudden it's like, what
that's it.
what was he smoking or drinking or taking or because what? I
Oh,
mean, I've had those kinds of reactions when it comes to some things like some movies or some other books in today's realm that I
mhm.
read, and I'm going, okay, I don't get that, but all right. So,
Oh.
what would be, you talked about Cask of Amontillado as being one of the things that pulled you in, Jackson, but
Mhm.
what are some of what some of the things, Annabelle Lee being the poem, of course, but are there others that you would rank higher, as things of
Or your favorites, or
yeah, because we've talked about how as we grow, as we change, things like we like to read or things that we interpreted would be different. So what would be in your life now? Would you still consider those your favorites, or is there something else you would
I'm gonna look
choose?
up the name of it because what is the one? It's the one where the guy is like made out of parts, and he goes in. He's
oh,
a
The Man That
uh,
Was Used Up.
yes, that's the one.
Mhm.
That's a great one and
I
very underrated.
I read that, and again, we talk about things as learning things as a student, and maybe being a little bit older and appreciating things more.
Yeah.
I sort of like as I don't know if I read that as a kid, but as being a you get a little bit older, you can appreciate, things, falling apart on you. So I when I read that story, I was
Mhm.
that resonated a little bit with me. So
Yeah.
and I know he meant it as satire, but yeah,
Yes.
but I
Yeah.
really like that story. That one I thought had more resonance.
Oh,
Uh,
very cool. Yeah, like Carmen said, it is one of the underrated stories because a lot of people were introduced to Poe specifics, but then very few of us, I guess, um, check in and read more of what he's written.
Hmm. Well, and and that was one of the things when we started the podcast was Poe is so much more than horror, and we want to express that with everybody that he did science fiction, and his literature, it has that satire, and even some of his most famous horror stories have that dark humor or satire in it.
Mhm.
And it's like, don't just love him because he's some people would say king of the goths or master of the macabre. He he was such a profound writer and could write pretty much anything, any style, and it
mhm.
was it's really good.
I'll tell you another
Yeah.
story too, which was I happened during the pandemic, in the early months of the pandemic, 2020. I happened to pick
Hmm.
up this book, and I was just like, oh, I'll just read a story. Open it up to random. And the
Yeah.
story I read was The Sphinx, which starts
Yes.
with him evacuating from New York City because I think it's yellow fever.
Yes.
And he's
Mhm.
Yes.
basically staying at the home of his friend in the country. And I was like, and again, I opened the book at random, and this was
Oh,
the story
wow.
that came up.
That was
And
apropos.
Yeah.
so yeah, that's talk about also having resonance that maybe in any other context would not have
Yeah.
hit as hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that one's another one. I mean, there's so many of his stories that, again, people, I guess, are not as familiar with because I think a lot of people read Poe in middle school and in high
Hmm.
school, Telltale Heart, Cask of Amontillado, Mask of the Red Death, what am I forget? Well, The Raven, of course, and Annabelle Lee.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many other stories that are so good. And so I think sometimes people stop reading Poe after high school. And then it seems like with a lot of people that we've talked to, some people do keep reading Poe, but then at certain times in your life of looking for different authors or like inspiration for different things, and Poe kind of comes back around.
You go back to the classics. Yep.
Yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah. And so we find it very interesting. I guess I have always kind of kept Poe close to me, and I think I think, well, yeah, I think I've always had a copy of something of his.
Mhm.
I've had one collection. It says, it's the complete collection, but it doesn't have everything in it for, I don't know, 20 something years. And it's my go to, and pages are starting to rip out now just because I've used it so much. But yeah,
It
it's
happens.
fascinating. Yeah, it is. Well, Jackson, one other thing I was going to ask you too was like, do you have a certain writing process whenever you're starting a new project or anything?
Yeah, so I generally found that what works for me is I'm a big fan of just keeping a notebook or keeping a journal,
Hmm.
and it's just writing down ideas. And I tell people to do this if they're looking for advice. I always say, just keep, if you have a random idea for a character or even a
Hmm.
name, a situation, a setting, just write it down.
Hmm.
And oftentimes I'll go back and I'll look at some of those and be like, okay, this is interesting or that's interesting. And what I generally find that I do is I like to take two different ideas, and the more different, the better, and sort of slam them together and see what comes out of it.
Oh, okay.
Um, when I was writing A Season of Whispers, for example, I had this idea of just, it was originally it was set in a contemporary setting. The idea was that I had this idea of a guy who's on the run and he hides out in a cabin in the woods, and it turns out that he's inherited from his grandfather, and it's this rundown place. And it turns out that he didn't know this, but his grandfather had something in the basement, and he sort of makes a deal with this something to protect him from the guys who are hunting him. So that was one idea. And
Okay.
then at the other time, I became fascinated with the transcendentalists, especially their utopian communes. And so I was like,
Hmm.
it'd be great to like set something in one of those communes. And then I was like, wait a minute, what if I put these two together? And so I find that a
Yeah.
lot of all that I write, short stories, all my fiction, it really comes out of that, taking these two ideas, putting them together, and being like, okay, if this is true, what else is true? And sort of
Hmm.
extrapolating from that, I think it's called the yes and method of like, if
Hmm.
this exists, then what else exists? What else does it imply?
Yeah.
And that's my process. And I find it's a formula without being formulaic.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Well,
worked for you. So
yeah, and I can only imagine, like you said, like if you're keeping a journal and writing down ideas here and there, and and then being able to pull random things together, that's really a very cool process.
Yeah, because it's like, okay, well, I had this, okay, I want to write something about, two people breaking up, and then you've got this other setting over here, and you start drawing lines and connecting it, and yeah, that's exactly what
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
Oh, that's really neat. Jeannie, what other questions do you have?
well, let's see. I think I've asked about the Poe. I've asked about your writing, and we've talked about your writing process. I guess what is your future? I know you said you had a book that's coming next March, correct? Was
That's
that?
right. It's from Regal House. It'll be out in March of 2025. It's called The Island of Small Misfortunes.
Mhm.
And just off the Connecticut coast, there's a series of islands. They're called the Thimble Islands.
Oh,
And
cool.
they are now at one time they were deserted islands, and then there's about, well, they say there's hundreds of them, but there's only about 30 or so that you can build on. And at the time, they
Mhm.
had summer houses. About the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, they had like little summer houses, little summer cottages.
Mhm.
Now there's multi-million dollar houses on them. Even some celebrities have been out there. And
Wow.
I highly recommend, if you ever can get out there, you can get a kayak or you can take a tour and you can go and look at the houses and not pay for them, which I think is the best thing to
That's
do.
great.
But the islands are absolutely beautiful. They're just these little islands just sticking out of the water with, houses on them.
Oh,
And so
neat.
the story, it's set in 1898, about this man. His name's Sequoia Owen. He's down on his luck, and he sort of, because of the Civil War, his family was divided. One side took one side, and the other took the other side.
Mhm.
And so he sort of reunites with his mother's family that he hasn't known for most of his life. And he's kind of like, well, maybe I can get some money out of him. So they invite him to their summer home on one of the Thimble Islands. It's a made-up Thimble Island that I made, called Toadcat. And they invite him to stay over. And he's thinking maybe he gets some money out of it. And he gets sort of embroiled in this whole family drama. And also the island is haunted.
Oh,
Ooh, even
nice,
So
better.
nice. Okay.
it's a gothic mystery, and I'm very excited about it.
That
It
sounds
sounds
exciting.
amazing. Well, and I want to also get your book, A Season of Whispers, because it sounds really interesting too. So,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
the Gothic ties definitely got me hooked.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So after that coming out in 2025, do you work on multiple projects kind of a little bit here and there, like shorter works at the same time as your
Sure.
books?
Yeah, I'm actually writing another gothic novella right now, and then I've got a couple of short stories coming out. I've got one in Tenebris Antiquities, which is out in June. That's a anthology by C.M. Muller. It's a historical fiction, and that's set in New York in the early 20th century.
Okay.
And then I'll have a story in the third volume of Love Letters to Poe in
Yes.
Okay.
October. And then, and then in March, the book comes out.
All right.
That sounds great. Yes, and I was going to say we've already ordered our copies of Love Letters to Poe, the third volume, so can't wait for that.
Now,
Awesome.
are
Yeah.
you on social media, Jackson, so our public can find you and
Yes.
stalk you?
Sure. I'm mostly on Instagram these days. So it's just Jackson Kuhl, one word, on Instagram. And I do just my life, but also my life as an author, but also I do reviews of novellas on there, and
Oh, cool.
sometimes I do some historic travel in the area. I'm in New England, so we're always tripping over something. So
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah. So Instagram is probably my big social media
Okay.
presence.
All right.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. And yes, and I know you have your website as well, which is just your name, www.
JacksonCool.com. Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah.
yes, because we want our viewers and listeners to be able to check out your work because it sounds amazing. And just from reading just your short stories in the first two volumes of Love Letters to Poe, you do great work.
Thank you so much.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Sarah Cookall Smith for putting
Connecting
us.
us.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, for being our middle person.
Yes. So I guess with that, Jeanie, we
We
are
are Poe
out.